History remembers leaders in extremes, heroes and villains, legends and failures. But what of the men lost in the shadows, the ones whose names are whispered not with reverence, but with disdain? Franklin Pierce, the 14th President of the United States, was such a man. Once a rising star, he would become one of the most despised leaders in American history. But how? What forces conspired to turn a man of promise into a president of infamy? This is the story of ambition, tragedy, and a nation tearing itself apart. Born in 1804 in a quiet New Hampshire town, Franklin Pierce seemed destined for greatness. His father was a Revolutionary War hero, his family respected. By his 20s, he was a gifted orator, a charming politician, a man who could sway a crowd with just a few words. The Democratic Party saw in him a future leader, someone who could unite, inspire, and carry the torch of a growing nation. They called him Young Hickory, a nod to Andrew Jackson, the fiery populist president. Pierce was handsome, charismatic, and fiercely ambitious. By 1834, at just 30 years old, he was elected to the U.S. Senate, one of the youngest in history. The future was bright, but beneath the polished exterior, cracks were already forming. Pierce had a weakness, one that would haunt him his entire life: alcohol. In an era when heavy drinking was common, even among politicians, Pierce's reliance on it was noticeable. Friends whispered of his struggles, opponents smirked, but for now, his charm outweighed the rumors. Then, in 1842, something unexpected happened. He quit, resigned from the Senate, walked away from power. Some said it was his wife, Jane, who convinced him, a deeply religious woman who despised politics. Others suspected darker reasons. Whatever the cause, Franklin Pierce returned home. But his story was far from over. War changes men, and when the Mexican-American War erupted in 1846, Pierce saw his chance at redemption. He enlisted, rose to the rank of brigadier general, and led troops into battle. But here, the first true shadows emerged. During a crucial charge at the Battle of Contreras, Pierce was thrown from his horse, an injury that left him unconscious. Some said cowardly. The truth? Unclear, but the whispers followed him home. By 1852, America stood at a crossroads. Slavery, expansion, division. The nation needed a leader. And in a shocking twist, the Democrats turned to a man who had once walked away, Franklin Pierce. He was the compromise candidate, the safe choice. But safe would not be enough, because what came next would break him. Just weeks before his inauguration, tragedy struck. A train derailed. Pierce and his family were aboard. When the screaming stopped, his only surviving son, 11-year-old Benny, was dead, crushed before his eyes. The boy's last words, "I hope father is elected." Franklin Pierce would take the oath of office a broken man, and a broken man makes dangerous choices. March 4th, 1853, a day that should have been triumphant. But as Franklin Pierce stood to deliver his inaugural address, no cheers greeted him, only silence. The nation knew. He was a grieving father first, a president second, and in his pain, he made a fateful decision: to govern as if nothing had happened. No mourning clothes, no public sorrow, just duty. It was a miscalculation that would define his legacy. The America Pierce inherited was a tinderbox. The Missouri Compromise had held the peace for decades, but now new territories clamored for statehood. Would they be slaver-free? The South demanded expansion. The North resisted, and Pierce, desperate to prove himself, chose a side, one that would shock the nation. 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Pierce's great gamble. The law overturned decades of precedent, allowing new states to decide slavery by popular vote. Popular sovereignty, they called it, a democratic solution. But what followed was anything but peaceful. Almost overnight, Kansas became a war zone. Pro-slavery border ruffians poured in from Missouri. Abolitionists armed themselves. Elections were rigged, newspapers burned, settlers murdered in their homes. And Pierce? He hesitated. Then he doubled down, recognizing the pro-slavery legislature as legitimate, even as its laws were written at gunpoint. The North erupted. Newspapers branded him a Southern puppet. Former allies spat his name. Even his own party turned on him. But Pierce, stubborn to the end, refused to bend. Why? Some say it was principle, others pride. But perhaps it was the whiskey talking. The drinking worsened. Cabinet meetings were missed. Diplomats reported slurred speeches. And as America burned, its president seemed adrift. Then came the final betrayal. 1856. Senator Charles Sumner, a fiery abolitionist, is nearly beaten to death on the Senate floor for condemning slavery. The attacker, a Southern congressman. The reaction from the White House? Silence. Pierce's refusal to condemn the act was the last straw. By 1856, even the Democrats wanted him gone. At the convention, they denied him renomination, the ultimate humiliation. When James Buchanan took the oath in 1857, Pierce left Washington without fanfare and without friends. He returned to New Hampshire a ghost. His wife, Jane, never forgave him for pursuing the presidency. His son was dead, his reputation, ashes, and the storm he helped unleash, it had a name now, Civil War. But Franklin Pierce's story wasn't over. In the war's darkest hour, he would speak words so shocking, they'd erase whatever remained of his name. Most ex-presidents fade quietly into history. But Franklin Pierce? He still had one last act to play, one that would cement his name in infamy. As the nation he once led tore itself apart, the man who had failed to prevent the war now faced a choice: stand with the Union or stand against it. The public had already turned on him. Newspapers called him the Benedict Arnold of New Hampshire. Even old friends crossed the street to avoid him. But Pierce refused to stay silent. And in July 1863, as thousands died at Gettysburg, he made his darkest speech yet. This war, this madness, is not for Union, but for abolition, and I will not pretend otherwise. The backlash was instant. Abraham Lincoln's government quietly investigated him for treason. Rumors swirled. Had Pierce secretly funded Confederate sympathizers? Had he corresponded with Jefferson Davis? No proof ever came, but the damage was done. His wife, already broken by grief, now lived in seclusion, refusing to speak to him. His remaining friends abandoned him. Even his alcohol wasn't enough to numb the isolation. And then the war ended, but not the scorn. For years, he wandered like a specter, writing bitter letters, drinking himself into stupors, watching as history memorialized Lincoln and vilified him, until one morning in 1869, his housekeeper found him, lifeless in his bedroom, a bottle still clutched in his hand. No state funeral, no grand eulogies, just a handful of mourners at a rainy graveside. Even in death, they punished him. His tombstone, a simple, unadorned slab. No president, no accomplishments, just Franklin Pierce, as if the office had never been his. But why does history hate him so? Was he truly a villain, or just a weak man, crushed by the weight of his times? Every few years, historians vote, and every time, Franklin Pierce lands among the worst, below even presidents who resigned in disgrace. But is this fair? Or has history judged him through the unforgiving lens of hindsight? Pierce inherited an impossible America. The Compromise of 1850 had only delayed war. The Whig Party was collapsing, and the abolitionist movement, once fringe, now thundered from pulpits and newspapers. Could any leader have held this union together? Historian Dura I, elderly stern, Pierce wasn't just weak, he was dangerous. His Kansas-Nebraska Act poured gasoline on the fire. Historian Dura II, younger, pushing back. But Stephen Douglas wrote the bill. Pierce merely signed it. If Buchanan or another Democrat had won in 52, would they have done any better? Perhaps his greatest sin was inaction. When Kansas burned, he dithered. When Sumner was beaten, he stayed silent. Leadership isn't just about decisions, it's about moral clarity, and Pierce faltered. The press certainly thought so. They caricatured him as a stumbling drunk, a Southern lackey. But here's the tragedy. Pierce believed in the Union. He just trusted systems over conscience, and in a moral crisis, that's cowardice. We judge presidents by their worst moments. For Pierce, it wasn't just policy, it was his voice during the Civil War. While young men died to preserve the Union, he called Lincoln a tyrant. That's not just failure, that's betrayal. Historians can debate his politics, but America never forgave his heart. Even now, he divides. Some see a cautionary tale, a man broken by personal loss and national duty. Others see only the worst of Northern complicity with slavery. But perhaps both truths can exist, because behind the infamy lies a question few ask. Who was Franklin Pierce when no one was watching? History records Franklin Pierce as a failed president, but before that, he was a failed father, and perhaps no wound cuts deeper. Benny, excited. Will I get to see you become president, father? They found Benny's body still clutching his parents' luggage. A boy who only wanted to serve his father's ambition, and from that moment, Franklin Pierce was never whole again. He took the oath of office office just weeks later. No mourning clothes, no tears. The papers called him cold. They didn't see the laudanum bottles hidden in his desk. Jane Pierce never recovered. She called Benny's death God's punishment for Franklin's political sins. For 4 years, she lived in the White House like a ghost, writing letters to her dead son while refusing to serve as First Lady. And drink he did. Not the social whiskey of his predecessors, but desperate, drowning gulps. Cabinet members found him incoherent at noon. Diplomats smelled spirits on his breath. Yet in his rare sober moments, he clung to one fragile hope, that saving the Union might redeem Benny's death. That delusion shattered in Kansas. Every burned homestead, every murdered settler became Benny's face in the flames. By 1856, even his allies saw it. The president wasn't leading. He was haunted. After the White House, the drinking worsened, but in his cups, truth emerged. Neighbors reported hearing him argue with phantoms. "I tried, Benny. God knows I tried." Before collapsing on the porch, they buried him beside Benny at last, the only peace he ever found. Perhaps we judge presidents too simply, not by their burdens, but only their failures, not by their hearts, but only their wars. Franklin Pierce carried wounds no leader could survive. Does that excuse him? Number, but it explains him. History is never static. Reputations rise and fall with the tides of time. Lincoln becomes marble, Grant becomes flesh. And Franklin Pierce? For over a century, his name was mud. But now, a curious thing is happening. We've been too hard on Pierce. Look at his letters. He warned the South secession would mean war. He was the first president to appoint Catholics to cabinet posts. Doesn't that count for something? Ah, but context is everything. Yes, Pierce warned against war. While enabling its causes, he expanded religious tolerance while tolerating slavery's expansion. This is the paradox of his rehabilitation. Every glimmer of progress shadows a deeper failure. The rehabilitation began quietly. First, psychobiographers noted how his son's death paralleled Lincoln's loss of Willie, yet where Lincoln channeled grief into resolve, Pierce drowned his. Then came the revisionists. What if Kansas violence was inevitable? What if any Democrat would have signed that bill? Don't mistake complexity for absolution. Pierce had choices. When the enslaved woman Nancy escaped to New Hampshire in 1853, he personally intervened, not to protect her, but to return her to her owner. That wasn't policy, that was character. Here lies the rub of modern reappraisal. We can understand trauma without excusing moral failure. We can contextualize without forgiving. Perhaps that's Pierce's real legacy, not as our worst president, but as our most human, flawed, broken, and ultimately accountable. In Concord, New Hampshire, there's no Grand Pierce monument, just that simple stone, often vandalized, sometimes adorned with pennies, a tradition for forgotten presidents. But look closer. Recently, flowers appear. Notes, one reads, "You mattered, your pain mattered." History's judgment is never final. As we grapple with our own fractured times, perhaps we see Pierce differently, not as a cautionary tale, but as a mirror. How much trauma can a leader carry before they break? And when they do, who pays the price? One moment, one choice. What if Franklin Pierce had listened to his wife, to his grief, and turned away from power? Would history have been kinder? Or would the coming storm have broken regardless? In this world, 72-year-old Lewis Cass, a dough-faced Democrat, even more sympathetic to the South, takes office in 1853. Without Pierce's personal trauma driving his need for validation, does the Kansas-Nebraska Act still pass? Almost certainly. Cass was its ardent supporter. Paradoxically, Pierce's failures may have saved the Union. His bungling of Kansas radicalized Northern moderates. His post-presidency treason talk steeled Lincoln's resolve. Sometimes, it takes the worst leader to reveal a nation's breaking point. But in our timeline, there was no refusal, just a broken man boarding that train, and a nation forever changed by what came after. Professor, challenging. We mythologize Lincoln's strength, but ignore Pierce's warning. What happens when small men inherit impossible times? Franklin Pierce's real failure wasn't the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It wasn't even the drinking. It was his fatal assumption that the office could heal the man, rather than the man needing to heal for the office. This is America's recurring delusion. We expect broken systems to be fixed by broken people. Pierce thought the White House could redeem his grief. Instead, it magnified every crack. The parallels terrify. Leaders who confuse motion for progress, who substitute personal pain for national purpose, who, when history demands moral clarity, search for compromise where none exists. We built monuments to Lincoln because his pain forged something greater. We erased Pierce because his pain only revealed what was already broken, not just in him, but in us. This is why Pierce still matters, not as a villain, not as a victim, but as the shadow we pretend doesn't follow every shining American moment. The warning that when we demand greatness from leaders without first demanding honesty from ourselves, the Pierce in us all wins.